So, since many of us have the day off today from work and school and many businesses are closed, I thought it relevant to talk about the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. since today is his birthday. And there has been some interesting developments in the story of his legacy. Now, I am no expert on the civil rights movement other than the general admiration and acknowledgement of all of the sacrifices made in order for us to have the rights that we have today. And Martin Luther King Jr. is seen as the righteous spearhead of that by many in America. Now, I think that his legacy has been very unfairly mistreated, and I'm going to talk about in a little bit of detail what he stood for, who he actually was based off of his quotes, and how he's been mischaracterized by media and our general understanding of him today. Now, we gotta start off by stating that, he was a devoted Christian preacher, very strong understanding of the Bible, and very devout in his views. But also, he was a black man in Jim Crow era South, helping to try and bring about the end of that era of terrorism and hatred and segregation. And I guess we'll start with the general attitude that the public had towards him during his time versus today. During his time, he was seen as an agitator, a disruptive force. He was hated, especially by conservative media. But in general, he was seen as doing too much. In today's parlance, people try, especially conservatives, will come out and say, "Oh, he was nonviolent. He was always about peace." Nonviolence for him was a tactic. He had the responsibility to try to keep his people safe, right? And he had the responsibility to try and represent peace to all Christians, whether white or black, because he was a preacher first. Now, like I said, my research is tertiary at best into this. I have a general knowledge from having grown up in this country and being Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy being part of our education system. But the misunderstandings that abound about him and the mismanagement of his legacy by our media is what I am trying to address. Now, I think we should start with the director of the FBI at the time in which Martin Luther King Jr. was conducting his activism. The director of the FBI's name, I have notes, very brief notes that I wrote. His name was J. Edgar Hoover. Now, J. Edgar Hoover was about as deeply racist as they come, right? Here are some of his more unsavory quotes. The protection of racial purity is a rule of life ingrained deeply as a basic truth. Now, do you think that is someone that this nation could trust with justice to be the standard of justice? I do not think so. Matter of fact, he had this whole program called COINTELPRO, counterintelligence program that the FBI operated, and this was their mission statement: to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralizing of black nationalist hate type organizations and groupings. Now, to be completely fair, that's rather biased. And we understand what his mission was. His mission was to disallow any progression or advancement towards a more equitable future for anyone other than, wealthy white people like himself. So, enter Martin Luther King Jr., a respected preacher of his community, an anti-capitalist during the Cold War, when capitalism was touted as the only the only correct way to live. And anything that even smacked of fairness was labeled communist, and you could be barred from many opportunities, if not fired from your job, or removed from your community. People fail to understand just how much ideological discrimination went on during the height of the Cold War and anti-communist propaganda, of which J. Edgar Hoover was a big part of, right? Martin Luther King Jr. at the time was not seen as a bastion of peace and liberation. He was seen as an anti-communist disruptive force. And the liberals and the conservatives of his day could not stand him. Regardless of whatever they felt about the more openly militant civil rights groups, Martin Luther King Jr. was more dangerous because of the size of his following, and they could not stand him, right? So, understanding his opposition came from the FBI itself within the American government, and that his movement was about obtaining further rights for all Americans, but most especially his people, Black Americans of the South, and upending the racial caste system of Jim Crow era South that was deeply entrenched in people's minds as tradition. This is what he was fighting against with all his marches and his speeches. And his he made speeches that were anti-capitalist. He made speeches that were anti-Vietnam War. How do you think he would feel about today's society, where capitalists insert our nation into war every opportunity that they get, right? He had this concept he called the giant triplets. And these are basically the great sins of our culture: racism, materialism, and militarism, right? That is the bread and butter of our ruling class today. Martin Luther King Jr., his ideas, when actually looked at and analyzed, are still progressive and still disruptive to the status quo. In our media, they highlight this concept of nonviolence, which Martin Luther King Jr. used as a tactic to try and protect his people from the wanton violence of the police in the South during the Civil Rights era and the end of Jim Crow. Jim Crow being the legal and cultural status quo of the racist South, who couldn't abide African Americans not being enslaved to the wealthy white owning class. It was him just speaking out against the status quo was about the most offensive thing that he could have done in his time. But he did so, and his house was bombed. His family was consistently threatened. He was imprisoned. He did face many things, many consequences for his actions, and opposition against his mission. Nevertheless, he stuck true. And he has this famous quote, but it seems to only be used by those of us on the left, because it shows what he was really about. He said that riot is the language of the unheard. Now, the way conservative media, and by conservative media I mean basically all American media, would have it, he advocated for nonviolence, meaning that you should not do too much to disrupt the way things are. Because from a capitalist perspective, violence is also violence is also the disruption of their money flow. Right? That was true back then and it's true today. Things are deemed violent when it disrupts the money flow of a capitalist entity or corporation. Right? Is it really violence? No. I mean, even if no one dies and you disrupt that money flow, they will still call it violent. And it was true back then too. Right? But he advocated nonviolence in the spirit of Gandhi, whose legacy was very strong at the time from his rights to gaining Indian independence, from his efforts at trying to gain Indian independence and his nonviolence rhetoric. Martin Luther King tried to echo that for the African Americans in the South of America here. Now, going back to the COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, and their mission to disrupt and expose and discredit African American groups, nationalist groups, civil rights groups, what have you. Let's bring it all the way up to today. Just last year, Donald Trump and his cabinet released files on Martin Luther King Jr. to, I guess, I would say that the point of releasing these files was, to throw the people a bone, but also to try and discredit the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. In the files, you see a picture of him as kind of like a partier or someone who slept around. I didn't read into it because honestly, I don't give it much credit. But I do believe that these FBI files were part of this COINTELPRO. And I do not believe that they were honestly acquired or even honest information regarding Martin Luther King Jr. I think it was just a bunch of slander that was intended to sling at him when they could or when they needed to, right? These this information about him and his personal failings may have been anecdotal. It may have been made up, and that's why they couldn't use it because it was inadmissible. It could have been anything, and it more to the point. The bottom line of it all was to slander him. So all that releasing this newer information about him did was to further the mission of a program by a racist director of the FBI during the civil rights era. So, as we have this day off and we think about Martin Luther King Jr., his legacy, the myth, and the historical truth of the man, we also got to understand that while he may not have been perfect in every way, these FBI files that have been released last year were designed to destroy his legacy and to destroy what he stood for. And what he stood for, we all benefit from today, right? Anyone who tries to tell you that, oh, he did this or he did that or he wasn't good because of this or that, they're either falling for the trick or they have malicious intent. Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy was first neutered by trying to take any kind of fight out of his mission by saying it was nonviolent. The powers that be conflate nonviolence and non-disruption. Martin Luther King was an incredibly disruptive force to very oppressive systems. and it's disingenuous to try and say otherwise. His "I Have a Dream" speech, the only thing that a lot of people are conscious of him ever saying, is the tip of the iceberg, and it was an olive branch to try and advocate for a peaceful change in society. But he wasn't that naive or that silly. That would be the media, who wants to keep a status quo, even if the status quo is unjust, unfair, and casteist. I consider racism a form of casteism, in case that misleads people. Now, moving on from how our society, our culture, and our media has neutered his message by taking away any kind of uh, adversarial oomph that his beliefs and quotes had. Let's look at 2025-26. We are in the most regressive period in modern American history. No bones about it. The presidential cabinet and all three branches of government are actively trying to turn back any form of progress towards equality and equity that has ever been made. Releasing old FBI files on what has become a cultural hero, simply to try and discredit and take away from his legacy. That's one thing I want to point out too. His family fought for many, many years to have his birthday recognized as a federal holiday, and they won that. And because people have the day off from work, it's the only reason that his memory is kept alive for a lot of your general public in America. I'm talking about like your general white public, especially. Now, we have moved from trying to neuter his message to trying to discredit his message. His message remains true. We all deserve a fair shake. Materialism, militarism, and racism are the great evils of the West, especially of America. Do not kid yourself about it. And whenever someone tries to call into question his legacy, call into the question the motives of those who would try and discredit his legacy. Right? What he stood for changed our society for the better and opened the doors for all of us. Regardless of whatever dirt this clearly racist program and the FBI during the civil rights era might have accumulated on him or invented about him or found anecdotal statements about him that they just didn't look into. It wasn't released at the time, and it being released now is really, the point of it is 100% to turn back the clock to the civil rights era. They're unsatisfied with the way things shook out then, so they want to redo it. Right? And I guess I'm going to end on this little thing. So we know the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, was a deeply entrenched racist. It doesn't take much research to learn that the man who was charged with assassinating him, James Earl Ray, was charged with killing him, was a felon at the time. But later on, he claimed innocence and that there was a conspiracy that ran deeper than himself and that he didn't actually do that killing. I don't know what he was a felon for. I didn't look that deeply into it. But I think it's something for us to think about. That you had a branch of our government trying to actively disrupt these civil rights movements. The Black Panthers, Martin Luther King Jr., the Muslim Brotherhood, anything that was seen as a black nationalist group. And they weren't above assassinations. Whatever you might want to think. The FBI is the internal is the internal intelligence agency, and the CIA is the external intelligence agency. There's not a whole lot of difference between the two. And Kash Patel, the current director of the FBI, he's not much better than J. Edgar Hoover. He is, despite the confusing nature of his identity, being a Hindu Indian, he advocates for white supremacy, and he throws white supremacy dog whistles out on national television. And he is the reason they got all these old files to discredit Martin Luther King Jr. Right? I think that white supremacy and caste supremacy, Brahmin supremacy, are very, very intertwined and related to each other. And Kash Patel represents that casteism, but in an American context where the high castes and the white people are the same on an emotional level for him, maybe. Now, what I'm trying to say is we should never trust the things that our intelligence agencies throw at us, because their intent is to protect the wealthy few at the expense of the rest of us. And Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy was one of opening the doors, of socializing our society, of bringing us closer to a harmonious way of being with our neighbors and those that are not the same as us. And he seen capitalism and militarism and racism as evils, demonic evils to be resisted and to be fought against. And we should do just that ourselves as Americans.